Great. So as people are joining, thank you guys so much for joining us today. We're going to be getting started in just a few moments, giving people a few seconds to get everyone checked in and situated. We'll get started probably right around 9:02. Thank you guys again for joining us. It's awesome to see so many people attending. Looking through, I can see Coos Bay, Southern Oregon, Ashland, a lot of really great connections from Southern Oregon. I see Eastern Oregon, the Columbia Gorge, Columbia County, Coos Bay, Lincoln City. So many great folks. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I see Eugene joining. This is fantastic. The Northern Oregon coast, Corvallis. It's wonderful to have you guys here with us today. We really appreciate you guys making time, especially on 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. So we're gonna give people just a few extra seconds to get checked in, and we're gonna get started. Perfect, I see Reedsport also here, more people coming out of Coos Bay and Polk County folks. That's wonderful. Oregon City is here. Wonderful. Okay, and we will start the recording in just a minute for those of us that aren't able to join today this morning at 9 a.m., but it's about time to get set and ready to go. It's awesome to see everybody. Perfect, so I think everybody is logged in. Again, thank you guys so much for joining us here at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. It is great to have you here to be able to pull together around these tools for organizational resiliency. It's great to get this time with you. Again, thank you for making this a part of your Monday morning. This program is sponsored and put on through the Oregon Destination Association in collaboration with Travel Oregon. And we're just thrilled to have this opportunity to share some of these tools with you today. There's so much that we'll get a chance to cover. So it's 9:02, let's go ahead and get started. Before we jump in though, there's one key thing that I did want to highlight to everyone, and that's that here's a brief reminder to make sure that you've had a chance to fill out the Oregon Tourism Stakeholder Survey. It's going to inform the next 4 years of strategic planning within Travel Oregon, and this is due on Friday, October 30th. So please be sure to make sure you get your insights and perspectives in there into that survey by Friday. We'll be sending out that link as well. So let's go ahead and jump in. We've got quite a lot to be able to share with you across this next hour. And what I really want to kick off with is introducing you guys to Matthew Landcamer. He's the principal at the Coraggio Group, and he's the lead of the travel and tourism practice within the organization. He really focuses on bringing strategic thinking and an innovation mindset to destination marketing organizations and attractions alike. He's worked with tourism organizations across like every scale, from rural communities like Visit Casper and Mendocino counties, Oregon communities like Coos Bay, who's here today, to metropolitan destinations like San Francisco Travel and Travel Portland. And then also he's worked with state agencies like us at Travel Oregon, the Utah Office of Tourism, and Visit California. And then some tourism attractions like even as large as NBC Universal Studios Hollywood. And he's keenly aware and interested in fostering that regional collaboration in destination marketing and bringing that voice of the visitor to rooms, especially in strategic input. So in terms of what you guys have to expect for today, in this 1 hour webinar that we're going through together, we'll get a brief overview of this Destination Recovery Toolkit and how those tools can really benefit your organization. We'll have a bit of a discussion around some of the common stumbling blocks and recovery approaches that we're hearing from the industry. And then there's a good amount of time for Q&A so we can do a deeper dive into getting these tools at your fingertips. We're going to be holding questions till the end, so we're going to make sure there's adequate time for us to be able to dive into as much as possible. The toolkit is available and going to be sent out to you guys as well, so you'll have that link at the end of the webinar. This webinar recording will be available on the Travel Oregon website, but specifically for the toolkit itself, the documents will be available to those that are registered participants, so we appreciate that. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. Matthew, we're going to pass it over to you to do the dive into this Destination Recovery Toolkit. And again, thank you guys so much for all attending. We're very happy to see you.
Terrific. Thanks, Alexa. And thanks to Travel Oregon and Oregon Destinations Association for having me this morning to talk about this. Let me get my screen going. So what I'm going to talk about today is a couple things. First, I'm going to talk about the Destination Recovery Toolkit, which is something that we launched a few months ago. as a sort of our response to help the industry out. But it continues to evolve and change in the way we think about recovery and response to everything we've dealt with this year. And then I'm going to talk about what response planning looks like a little bit now that we've been doing some of that, just to give you some insights into how you might think about that for your own destination. And then, as Alexa indicated, we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. So let me jump in. First, just a little bit about Coraggio. I know Alexa introduced me. If you're not familiar with us, we're a Portland-based consulting firm. We've been around for 15 years, and one of the things we specialize in is travel and tourism. We have about half of the firm focused on travel and tourism work, and I have the great privilege of leading that team, which is a lot of fun. And we work coast to coast, though mostly in the West, as you can see, and a ton in Oregon and California, but also destinations on the East Coast as well. Just a little bit of contact information from me if you want it. And this will be, I think this slide deck will be offered to everybody afterwards, so in PDF form. So this is ways you can get a hold of me if you would like to. Okay, so now onto the toolkit. Enough about us. So I recently found myself clicking on, and I'm sure it was a clickbait headline, but I clicked. It was 3 tools to deal with existential dread. And I think that was maybe the most 2020 headline ever. So, but I was curious, like, how do I deal with existential dread? Because it's in abundance right now. And this year has been wild, and it started wild, and it just continues to get wilder, I think. Whether it's the obviously the pandemic, but also we've had some really severe weather events around the country. I know personally, my brother was fighting a fire in Colorado this week. So it's, it continues to be quite a wild year. And so for many of our clients, this has been a really devastating time, or at best, a really upending time, a time of really profound change. And so early in this pandemic, when it became clear that this was going to have a massive impact on tourism, we at Coraggio sort of didn't know what to do. We felt really empathetic to all of our friends out in the industry and what they were going through. And so many people were undergoing budget cuts and staffing cuts, unfortunately, and just things were really upended. And so we came up with the idea of putting together a toolkit that could help them respond to these changes and give them a sort of clear path and a clear set of tools that they could use to understand what their next steps could be. Now, that was months ago. That was, I think, in March, maybe April. I think maybe it was April when we launched the thing. And that seems like a year ago. And things have changed since then. And I'll talk more about what we've been doing since. But I think the toolkit still really stands as a really useful set of processes that you can go through, because this isn't a one and done kind of recovery. This is going to be something that's going to cycle for a while. And I think we're going to see that there'll be recovery and there'll be retraction, and it's probably going to waver for a while before we sort of get to a new normal, whatever that looks like. So although this toolkit was conceived in the early days of the pandemic, before everything else happened this year, I think it still is a really useful set of tools. Here's how it's built. There's 4 parts to it. The evaluate module comes first, and that's really about getting the lay of the land. What is going on in your destination? What's going on with your stakeholders? What's going on with your organization? Whether that's your funding, skill sets, what have you, just so you know what sort of your operating environment is. The second set of tools, the prioritize module, will help you understand sort of what do we do first and what can wait a little while. And that's really important, especially in times of crisis, to sort of triage decision-making so that you're not trying to do everything at once. Activate, the third module, sort of gives you the idea of what to do once you have your priorities. Now you know what to do. How are you going to do that? And so is that forming teams to get things done, changing decision-making, what have you? And the final module, lead, is really about maintaining this from a leadership stance as you go through change. This toolkit will be sent to all of you participants in this webinar after the webinar. And I think Alexa is going to share a link maybe with you at the end of the webinar as well, so that you can download it. And I do just want to note that you're invited to use this toolkit yourselves and for your destinations. We are charging for it now. You're getting it free. So we just ask that you respect that and feel free to use it for you and your destination. But this is a sort of special gift for participating in the webinar. All right, so let me talk through the 4 modules and sort of the tools that are in them. And keep track if you have any questions about any of these. When we get to Q&A at the end, I'm hoping to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So if you have any questions about these, keep track and I'll be happy to go deeper on anything that's interesting. So module 1, evaluate. There's 5 tools here. The first is stakeholder engagement. And we do a lot of strategic planning at Coraggio Group. We've done it for Travel Oregon. We've done it for other destinations in Oregon and elsewhere. And stakeholder engagement is always step 1. You have to know what's going on in your tourism community and what those stakeholders need, what they're experiencing, what they're hoping for from you before you start making any decisions. And in a time of crisis, I think it's even more important. You really have to get the lay of the land from your stakeholders. So that's step 1. Step 2, or tool 2, is about measuring the impacts to your destination. So this is building an understanding of what has changed. Some businesses probably have lost some business and gone down. Maybe you've lost some. Sadly, there are restaurants and other tourism-oriented businesses that have just gone out of business and not been able to survive. So quantifying what has happened in your destination is an important input to understanding how to strategize against that. Organizational impacts then turns that attention inward. What has happened to our destination organization? So if you're a small DMO, or even if you're an adjacent sort of organization, has our budget been impacted? Have we had to have a staffing reduction? And so are we missing some skills now? Or maybe none of that has happened, but you're just overwhelmed with the new work and the pivot work that's not allowing you to get to your other more standard work. And that's an organizational impact as well. So this is really just about understanding what your organizational capacity is in this new situation you find yourself in. Windsocks this is one of my favorite parts of the toolkit. We use the metaphor of windsocks to talk about leading indicators out in the world that you can keep an eye on. And if you're not familiar, a windsock is it's a hollow fabric tube that you'll see at a small regional airport. It's attached to a pole, and it allows pilots or ground crews to get a really quick read on what's the speed of the wind and what's the direction the wind's coming from. If the wind's blowing really strong, the tube fully inflates and it stands straight out. If it's a light breeze, it kind of hangs limp, and it lets you know what direction it's going. It's a really simple tool, but it tells you a lot. And so we think of windsocks the same way. These are data points that you can look at out in the environment to get a heads up of what conditions look like. And importantly, when you're looking to recover from a crisis like this, looking at things like occupancy or average daily rate, those are looking in the rearview mirror. And that's good information to have, and you need to have it, absolutely, but it doesn't help you anticipate what you need to do next. And so in the windsocks, we're looking at things that can really help you think ahead. And that's in 4 categories. We're looking at economic factors, we're looking at public health factors, we're looking at general travel and tourism trends, and then we're looking at local factors as well. What are you experiencing on the ground in your destination? And so that tool helps you get organized on what are we going to keep our eyes on so that we know when it's time to pivot. And I'm going to talk more about that later when I talk about what response planning looks like. But I think windsocks are a really critical tool. It's a little bit hard to wrap your head around, like what are those things we're going to measure and how are we going to keep track of them? But I think anybody having the discipline to do that right now gets a really great advantage. Then the final tool in this evaluate module, future opportunity. There are opportunities for some destinations in this rolling series of crises that we call 2020. And this isn't true for everybody. I don't want to come across as a Pollyanna. This isn't a great year for everybody. And even for those where there is some opportunity, it still may be a terrible year in every other respect. But from a strategic standpoint, taking a step back this year from the disaster and saying, where's their opportunity, can be really powerful strategically. For instance, I've seen a lot of destinations have outdoor recreation opportunities really explode this year. And you wouldn't have guessed that this would be a strong year, but there are a lot of places in the West that have had record summers. So can you build a future opportunity out of that influx of outdoor rec folks? Can that become a more permanent part of your mix? And so this tool is really about just getting you to focus on those things and thinking about long-term, how can you maybe anticipate some more permanent changes that might actually be good for you? Okay, second module is prioritize. And there's 4 tools in this one, starting with triage decision-making. I referenced this a few minutes ago. You need to make a lot of decisions when you're operating in crisis mode, and deciding what is the most important is really critical to making good decisions. You need to be making decisions on the most important things first and not getting distracted by things farther down the list. So this is a tool that just helps you understand what's the real priority. Decision criteria are another decision-making tool, but these are a set of statements that give you sort of guidance as you make decisions, something you can test your decisions against. So when we do strategic planning with organizations, we use values a lot as a sort of type of decision criteria. Is this strategy that we're talking about taking congruent with our organizational values? Might be a question we would ask somebody. Well, the decision criteria are the same way. This is a set of statements that you can say, does this strategy meet these criteria? For instance, you might implement a decision criteria that says any strategy that we take in this recovery must have the opportunity to support all of our tourism stakeholders. So you might have an agreement, we're not going to focus on one sector, we're going to try to do stuff that supports everybody. That's a decision criteria then. And if you have a strategy that in your draft plan, you can say, does it meet that criteria or not? And if something doesn't meet most of your decision criteria, then maybe you should question whether you should do that. So these are just tools to help you stay on track and not get distracted by the shiny opportunities. Recovery marketing is a way to think about staging your comeback. And I know many of you have already done this, but again, I think there's a possibility that this is going to go up and down. The way case counts are going up in the US right now, I'm not sure about what the fall and winter hold for us, but it may not be good. So even if you've been able to start to bring your marketing back, there's a really good chance you're going to need to contract it again. And this recovery marketing tool is about thinking about what those phases are, where you're going from talking to your local community to maybe talking to a slightly broader audience to maybe going back to whatever your new normal audience is. And coordinated partnership is about engaging with those stakeholders in your community and other organizations that you need on your team as you implement this stuff. Module 3, activate. 3 tools here. The first, talent needs. Now that you've assessed what the impacts have been to your destination and to your organization, and you've prioritized some things that you need to do, now you need to start thinking about how you're going to get it done. You may have very different talent needs than what you did before 2020. You may need more talent around social media or around PR than you did before, for instance. And you may have talent needs because you've had to change staff, and that may have left you without some things on the table. So just getting really clear on where your gaps are, whether that's because you have a new need or whether that's because you've lost talent, helps you know what the gaps are to fill. Rapid response teams. This really is crisis focused in that this is getting rid of red tape in a way. How do you build teams who are empowered to make decisions on their own within certain guidelines? They don't have total free reign, but how can you give a team some really clear guidelines and say, go solve this problem on your own? You don't need to check back on everything because we don't have time for a sort of bureaucratic decision-making process. We need teams who can just go get things done and know what the goal is. And they can activate these strategies within those decision criteria that you've designed, for instance, and using the windsocks to know when to make certain decisions. So they're not on their own, but they are empowered. And this is about how to really build those empowered teams. Recovery resources. This is a section of the toolkit that shares resources out there in the world. A lot of them are federal resources. Now we're getting to a point where that's changed quite a bit, I think. So some of these may not be as active any longer, but it's still a good inventory of what's out there and places to look for that kind of information. The final module, Lead, has 5 tools. Organizational restructuring. So as I mentioned before, you may have needed to reduce your staff if you had a dramatic budget cut. Or there may be other reasons you need to restructure because you now need new skills. And that doesn't necessarily mean swapping out people. It may mean thinking about how people divide their time. So you may need to do a little training to get somebody up to speed on a certain skill you need, and that may require a different percentage of their time doing a certain thing than they were before. So roles may shift, and that's an important part of the organization. In our world, you don't think about the organization structure until you've got a really clear strategy. And by this point in the toolkit, you know what your priorities are, you know how you're going to activate them. Now you can say, what does the organization need to be to support that? Impact tracking. So this goes back to the WinSox, but also to making sure your strategies are doing the things that you want them to do. I'll talk a little bit more about how to use WinSox and tracking as I get into response planning in a bit. But this tool is really just how do you think about keeping an eye on that stuff so that you know what you're doing is doing what you intend it to do. And if not, then you can course correct. Change leadership. At Coraggio, I think 5 of us are certified in ProSci change management, which is a time-honored and sort of data-backed methodology for leading through change. And it's a process that we buy into. This tool in the toolkit is not the ProSci organizational change management toolkit, but it is a sort of aligned idea of how to think about change in your organization, in your destination. And there are certain things that you can do to make that as productive as possible and to minimize the amount of redirection you need to do. Crisis communications works really closely hand in hand with that. It's about identifying who those audiences are you need to talk to, what messages are you going to need to be sending, how frequently do you need to communicate, what modes are you going to use, just so that this is all mapped out ahead of time. It's easy to forget to communicate in a crisis. And if you don't have it clearly mapped out, here's the monthly things we need to share, it's easy to forget something. And then you have people operating in the dark, which is not what you want to have happen right now. And finally, resilient organization. And this is really resilient people and organization. There's tools in here to both think about your individual resilience and how resilient your organization is. And this is things like making the work meaningful, having some sort of mindfulness or spiritual practice that grounds you every day, using data ruthlessly, really being true to what is real and not getting distracted by what you think. So it's about being present and understanding what reality is, which is a really great setup for being resilient. If you're making any sort of assumptions, that's a brittle breaking point potentially. And I can certainly talk more about that. Okay, so that's the 4 modules. How do you use this toolkit? So we're thinking of the recovery, so to speak, or any sort, I guess our sort of a return to whatever normal is going to look like. This is going to happen in loops. It's not going to be a straight line or even a wavy line. I think it's going to be sort of like this for a while. And so we think of the toolkit as being deployed like this. You use the evaluate module, get the lay of the land, think about what you might need to do. You prioritize those things you need to do. You activate them, and then you lead through that change for a while. But then you're going to need to do it again and again. So we're seeing this, using the toolkit as being the sort of cyclical implementation. You're not going to do it once and get it right. You're going to need to come back to those evaluate tools and come back to those prioritize tools. And I should say, I don't think there's probably a destination on the line today that would use all the tools in this toolkit. It's probably overkill. And that's the way the toolkit's intended to be used. It's sort of as a la carte kit of parts that you can look in this and see which of these tools would bring you the most value and put them together in a way that works for you. And I should offer too, my contact information is going to be in the PowerPoint deck that gets shared to you. If any of you want to reach out and get on the phone with me and get some advice on which tools might work best for you, I'm happy to do that. I don't think anybody should try to use all of them, but I do think finding the ones that are most useful and appropriate for you and applying them in order is probably the way to go. The tools themselves are organized in the book. There's an introduction that sort of tells you what it's about. There's a set of questions that say, is this tool right for my organization? You can see that on the lower left there on the left page. And this is the self-performed part of, am I picking the right tools? Ask yourselves those questions and give honest answers. And maybe that tool is for you, maybe it isn't. And then the tools are organized with, some of them have multiple parts to them, and each part has its own set of instructions. And then there are often these sort of open matrices for you to fill in answers. And you could literally print out the PDF and just handwrite some answers in, or you could create your own tools that match this and maybe build a more complicated one in Excel and use that to track this. So this is the recovery marketing tool here. And you can see the tool there looks at public health, economic, travel and tourism, and local. Those are the WinSocks. And then the stages, emergent, calibration, and full engagement. And so you could put your ideas in those just on this page or build your own more complicated tool. But either way, you've got the idea of what the structure is. Okay, so that's the toolkit. And like I said, you're going to get a link to that from Alexa, where you'll be able to download that from Dropbox. It's a PDF, I think it's 30 some pages or so, and it should be pretty self-explanatory from there, given the introduction I just gave you. I want to talk for a few minutes about response planning. We got into this talking about recovery. The further we get into this year, we're just thinking more response right now. And we're thinking longer term about resilience. So right now, the question is, how do we help organizations be responsive? How do we help them in this moment, in this year, make plans that give them the sure footing to make sure they're being responsive and not just reactive to changes? And then longer term, we're turning our focus to how can we help destinations be resilient in the long term, so that the next time there's a crisis in their place, they're more prepared. And I've got a lot of ideas about that. And actually, we've been collaborating with, if you're familiar with Miles Partnership, they're a national agency, a marketing agency that works in the travel and tourism space. But we've been working with them to develop a framework for what a resilience assessment would look like for a destination, and then how to integrate that into all your planning, whether that's your marketing planning, your strategic planning, or your long-term destination planning. But this midterm right now, response planning, I'm going to give you an idea of what this looks like. Because if you take yourself through this toolkit, you could then be prepared to do this kind of planning on your own. So we're thinking of this really simply as boom and bust. And we could do it a lot more complicated. We could do really complicated scenarios and think about what are these different forking paths that your destination might encounter. But when we broke it down, we thought the easiest way to think about this is you need to be prepared to move into a boom sort of economy for your visitor economy, a bust economy, or sort of business as usual. And so these are just some ideas of what might look like a boom economy. Restrictions begin to lift locally and domestically. Consumer confidence grows. Unemployment numbers improve, so people have more money to spend. You see some occupancy bump up. You see group sales and events and conferences coming back. So these are sort of like the WinSocks that we talked about. These are things out in the environment that tell you that maybe you're entering into a boom economy. And then that list at the bottom, what we're seeing is there's some sort of counterintuitive stuff happening where actually some things that are not great for the country or not great for your state may actually be promoting a growth in tourism in certain areas. Now, this tends to be rural areas. I would not want to be a big city tourism agency right now, but there are some rural areas who have done quite well this year because people are looking for places to spread out. And so things that sound bad but might actually spur more spending are shutdowns in your competitor markets or your feeder markets, which leaves your wide open spaces more attractive perhaps. Or if there's some more stimulus, that could spur vacation spending. Or if vaccinations take a long time, again, rural destinations might still be in a really good position where people feel safer there. And if people move out of cities, that could do well too. On the bust side, if you've got shutdowns due to COVID locally, that's of course going to be really problematic for any visitor economy. Social distancing conditions, consumer confidence decline, unemployment growth with no stimulus. So, that would lead to things like declines in visitor spending and declines therefore in tax revenues. And hotel occupancy would drop. You may lose some attractions or local assets. And so if you've done well during COVID, some changes that might lead to a bust for you would be if travel restrictions lift in some of your competitive markets. So now maybe those people who've been coming to you because you feel safer may go back to the places they used to go. Winter season, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if there's going to be a really severe uptick in COVID-19. We don't know with people not being able to distance outdoors as much, if that's going to suppress travel and people's use of some of those key assets. So that's a worry. I think a vaccine would be a great thing, but it may reduce the draw of open spaces. So, bear those things in mind for your own destination. And I hate to be sounding sort of ghoulish, and I hope I don't. I think just recognize and be realistic about when these things happen, it may have this effect on our visitor economy. And it's not that we're hoping that this thing happens that's bad, but if it does, we just need to recognize we may get more traffic. And so we need to be prepared for that. Here's what a really basic framework for a response plan would look like. And this is an Arctic town. This is our sort of made up destination. So you can see there's a few windsocks up at the top. These are, again, those external factors you keep your eyes on. Sustained reduction in new cases, Google Trends search queries. So this is just a simple way to look and see for a given search for Arctic town and hotel, how has that trended since the early days of the pandemic? And maybe your local restaurant tax receipts are going up. So those are just some sort of crude ones, but it gives you an idea of the things you might keep your eye on. And then you'd sort your strategies into boom, bust, and business as usual strategies. And so what we've been doing with destinations, particularly small rural destinations, is saying, here's your list of windsocks, and they've got maybe 8. And we'll say, when these are up and these are down, that means you're going into boom. And so you've got a whole set of strategies in the boom category that you're now going to pivot to. And I'll show you a little bit more on the next slide. The final 2 pieces of this are that monitor and adjust plan and the continuous communications plan. So this is, how are we going to watch our windsocks and know when to pivot? And how are we going to communicate to our stakeholders and our internal folks on a regular basis throughout this? When we think about organizing your boom strategies and your bust strategies and your business as usual strategies, we think about doing them in 3 categories. And we're just trying to keep this as simple as possible. There's must do, should do, and would be nice to do. So those, if you look at the boom strategies line there, there's 4 things under must do, or 4 blanks, 4 openings under must do. Those are the things you're going to do first. And if you've got those well in hand, then there's another set of 4 that are in your should do list. And then finally, if you can get to all of those and you still have time and resources, get to the would be nice to do stuff. We don't want to give people the idea that they can just make a long list of strategies and undertake them all in a crisis time. That doesn't work. So we really need to help you understand, what do we have to do? And so we're moving into a boom scenario. Looks like probably these things that are changing are going to drive traffic back up or even up further than what it has been. How do we as a destination respond to that? Okay, final thing I want to talk about before we go to Q&A, just to share some things we're hearing out in the industry, because we work across so many states, particularly in the West. This seems like it might be useful to all of you. So some stumbling blocks we're seeing out there. The first thing is this uneven recovery. There's been a lot of discussion about the shape that the recovery might take in this recession. You've probably heard about these. There's the V-shaped recovery, which I think we're all clear is not going to happen, has not happened, and it's too late for that to be the case. There's the U-shaped recovery, where it dips and it stays low for a while before it slowly comes back up, or you might hear that referred to as a bathtub-shaped recovery. There's a W-shaped recovery, where it goes up and down. And then there's a K-shaped recovery. It's a sort of new conversation that we've been hearing out there. And that's where parts of the economy go up and parts of the economy go down. And in travel and tourism, we're seeing a lot of evidence of a sort of K-shaped recovery right now, because some destinations have been hurting really badly in 2020. And some destinations that we've been working with have had their best year. And it's wild that that's the case, but that is what's happening. So even within a state like Oregon, undoubtedly there is a great variety of recovery that's gone on. And so probably this K-shaped recovery is what we need to think about. We've seen a lot of funding cuts, of course, and reduced organizational capacity. I know Oregon as a state has not been immune to that. And I know there's sadly been a lot of that here. And that's, hopefully we're at the end of that and organizations will start building back up. But we have definitely seen that that's been the case throughout the West. Threat of assets not reopening. There's both the uncertainty of public health requirements or public health rules, but there's also just the threat of businesses not making it. And a lot of people are worried about that. And a lot of what makes their destination unique, like, are those things going to still be around when this is all said and done? Unclear timelines to reopening, that continues to be a challenge. We just don't know. I know we've all done some reopening, but we don't really still have a handle on what the timeline looks like. Cyclical lockdowns, and I talked about the looping and the sort of W-shaped recovery. I think we're seeing that a lot, that there's been, one step forward, two step back kind of stuff going on out there. Slow economic re-engagement, and that persisted through the summer in some places, where just the spending, and I think a lot of people are just uncertain about their financial future. And so that spending on vacations and things like that has been a little slow to respond in some areas. Destination brand deterioration. This is, I think, tougher for more urban destinations probably, but it's also a potential for rural destinations who maybe have had a really big influx of visitors over the summer and may have some brand deterioration from that as well, from even some crowding potentially. Different stakeholders aligning differently on timing, and this may be a difference between what the local business community wants and what the local health agency is willing to do, or maybe the local administration versus local business community. So we just have seen a lot of destinations sort of caught in the middle between these different ideas of how we should be opening and at what speed. Resident pushback to reopening, of course, there's a lot of fear involved with the pandemic, and that can lead some residents to be really reticent to allow new folks to come into their communities. Challenges across borders, as different jurisdictions have different rules. That's caused some places to sort of have, perhaps an influx of folks that they're not ready for, and that they don't feel as safe because they have different rules than what's across the border. And I probably don't need to remind anybody of what's happening a week from tomorrow. There's a lot of political uncertainty in the United States right now. And I think that everybody's sort of holding their breath, both in the business community and just as, families thinking about vacationing. It's just that just adds to uncertainty and makes it harder for people to make decisions. On the upside, I want to talk about some positive developments we've seen out there. I'm a huge fan of collaborative regional planning in destinations. I think visitors don't really care much about geopolitical boundaries unless they're going to like Four Corners, for instance, where the geopolitical boundary is the attraction. I don't think they care very much what county they're in or what have you. They care about what the destination is and what it has to offer them. And so I've always felt like there's a missed opportunity when adjacent destinations that have complementary offerings aren't playing well together. And I've seen a lot more of that playing well together happening this year, because I think people kind of feel forced into it. But I do see it as a really positive development, and I hope it sticks around. Acceleration of destination development opportunities. This one's really interesting to me, but I think unexpectedly, some things that are really positive for destinations that their cities can do through code enforcement or zoning or things like that, that they've sort of had a hard time getting traction on, they now sort of have the ear of City Hall. And there are some things that are moving quickly because suddenly City Hall sees the need for these things. Now that the tourism economy is threatened, there's a lot of renewed interest in what can we do to support it. And I think some of those things are going to be good for destinations in the long term. Whether that's more access to outdoor dining or things like that, I think it's positive. There's some pivots here, pivot to drive market, of course, which is, I think, just a really smart move that destinations have done all over the country. And it's not rocket science, of course, that's what you do. But sort of re-engaging with the regional market as a way to keep your assets afloat has been really powerful. And a pivot to rural tourism. I'm bullish on the future of rural tourism, especially in the West. I think we're seeing an uptick now because of the pandemic, but I think there's going to be some lingering effects of that. And I think long-term, this probably is good for rural tourism. I think it's going to be a while before people en masse want to go back into really crowded cities at the same level that they did before. And I think there's just going to be a lot more attraction to those rural areas with more open spaces. And with that, we've seen people taking on outdoor recreation in ways that they haven't before. And I think a lot of people are trying new outdoor rec activities that they haven't before. And that is good for the industry as well. Increased recognition of the importance of tourism to overall economic competitiveness. This is tied to that destination development opportunities that I talked about, but the visitor economy has the attention of elected officials these days. One of the trends I've been seeing recently is there's a lot of new DMOs being set up, or at least several, but it seems to be a pattern. I'll see if it persists, but I think there are some cities who are sort of now saying, okay, we can't take this for granted. We actually need to set up a formal destination marketing organization and promote this intentionally going forward because they took such a hit during this time. Data sharing. I'm seeing destinations and their stakeholders much more willing to share data with one another, sort of banding together in a crisis, but I think that's good for destinations as a whole long term. Cooperation on safety standards and programs, likewise, I think it's just a really good sign of folks working together. And then I think there's some stuff that comes in with destination safety that's really good for destination stewardship long term. So some of the sort of visitor education and encouraging people to be good visitors, I think is really good long term for getting people to engage with your destination in a really healthy way that feels good to your residents and feels good to them and is respectful of your assets and your attractions. And with that, Alexa, I think we can go to Q&A. Alexa's going to share questions with me in the chat here, and we'll answer them as they come. So go ahead and shoot your questions over.
Perfect. That sounds great. Anyone that wants to add a question, please be sure to use the Q&A feature. Matthew, our first one is around, how does this apply to me if, for example, we had a really awesome summer this year?
Yeah. So I think it's not recovery planning for you if you had a really awesome summer, but I think it is response planning. And so there's a couple of things that you want to keep in mind. One is resident sentiment, because if you got a sudden spike in visitation because of what was going on, keeping your finger on the pulse of resident sentiment so you don't overstretch that welcome, I think is really important. And the other thing is I'm going to mangle the metaphor here, but don't count your chickens and think they're permanent. If you had a really great summer, it doesn't mean you're going to have a great fall and winter. And I've seen some destinations in other states, not in Oregon, but I've seen some destinations sort of acting with a little bit of hubris and saying, we've had a really great summer, we're just going to operate as if that's going to continue to be the case. And I would be much more cautious about what's coming. So if you had a great summer, this is response planning is still really appropriate for you, because you want to have some strategies in your boom area, if that continues to boom, so that you can take advantage of that and build on it and protect what you've got and protect against resident sentiment turning negative. but also be prepared if that then collapses. And so you've got some of those bust strategies as well. So whether you've been enjoying good times or not, I think that response planning thinking of what do I do when it's booming? What do I do when it's a bust? And what are the things I need to do regardless is still useful.
Perfect. That's fantastic. Our next question is about, as a developing destination, what advice would you give right now around new branding, a new website and social media, and half the expected budget?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So I don't think, a personal opinion, I don't think it's necessarily a bad time to roll out a new brand. I think people are going to be sort of couch surfing for destinations a little bit more perhaps than they did. And even if they're not ready to pull the trigger on travel, they're going to be thinking about travel a lot. So a new brand isn't necessarily a bad idea. Doing that on a shoestring budget though, that's where I think I would say use some of the prioritized tools in this toolkit to really make sure you're putting your resources towards the things that are most important. And so you probably don't want to be rolling out big campaigns right now. Maybe it's more of a soft launch, and that you're prepared that as things ramp up, that you're going to then have the investment to roll it out when the timing's more appropriate. So sort of quiet soft launch maybe would be one way I would go, but understand what your timing is for when you can turn the heat up and use those now limited resources. Hopefully that answers the question.
Perfect, thank you. The next question, this toolkit sounds exceptionally robust. For those of us that are just diving into it, what are the most important tools that we should probably sink our teeth into first?
That's a good question. So I think in my mind, the WinSox tool is super important. I think engaging with your stakeholders is super important, not necessarily in this order. I think using the decision criteria tool is super important. I think forming activation teams and thinking about how are you going to activate against strategies is really important. And then I think the personal opinion, the resilience tool in the lead module, I think is really important just for everybody right now. Going back to what I said at the beginning, clicking on the link for how to deal with existential dread. I think everybody can use a little extra guidance on how to be resilient right now, both as an individual and as an organization, and that's in there too. So I would list those things, really thinking about your stakeholder community, your WinSox, how to use decision criteria to prioritize, how to build teams to activate against that, and how to do things to be a resilient organization and person.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is exceptionally important. Their response was, we were feeling great about our COVID recovery plan, and then the wildfires started. What's the best way to approach compounding crises like these that we couldn't see coming?
Yeah. So I longer term, and I'll come back to the shorter term, I think, but longer term, I think we all need to, and when I say we, I mean you all, destinations need to be building some resilience stance into their organization long term. And that means having that built into your marketing plan, your strategic plan, and your destination plan, if you have those. To whatever degree you're a planful organization, having resilient strategies built into those and having resilience practices built into the organization puts you on a footing where you can be more responsive to unexpected crises. That said, I think we also need to recognize that wildfire is part of our new normal in Oregon. You don't know what year it's going to hit you, but you know that it's always possible. In the same way that the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake is always possible. We don't know when it will happen, but at some point we'll have a big earthquake. And this is Oregon, and we've got a lot of communities that are in that sort of urban wild interface zone. And I think fires are something that we all should be keeping on our radar. So back to the more immediate question though, how do you deal with, you're already doing well with your COVID recovery when crisis 2 hits. I think you've got to go back to the decision criteria if you've got them, and so that you're really focusing on what's most important. What are the things that we have to do for the destination? And so as we respond in this moment to this new unexpected crisis, are we doing things that keep that long-term view intact and that do all the things we want to do, or are we just being reactionary to what's happening now? Which is probably not a sort of satisfying answer, but keeping decision criteria as a North Star in those moments, I think can help you sort of separate out, what's really important versus what seems like it's important right now.
That makes sense. We have a great comment as well. One person mentioned that many now more than in the past are researching and preparing their own travel, and the lack of communication, networking, and connecting is really evident and affects the overall experience. You'd also mentioned that there was a best practice around more of that regional collaboration. Going from this resiliency standpoint, how should destinations be collaborating either at a kind of local or regional level for success?
Yeah, so just to talk some of the strategies I've seen emerge in some of the planning work we're doing with rural organizations. I think regionally they're thinking about aligning messaging is one really important thing. And that doesn't mean that there's one central point organization that does all the messaging for a region. It means that everybody in the region is coming together frequently. They've got somebody who's agreed to track the numbers, watch the windsocks, if you will. And so they can all collectively say, okay, we're moving into a more of a boom time. We all agreed that when we move into a boom time, we're going to talk more to our visitors about the wealth of destinations we have so that we can disperse that visitor across our area. And so instead of everybody just trying to hoard this new wealth, it's an idea of, wow, we can support this whole region really effectively if we act in concert. And so that's just one example, but I think having those planned out ahead of time and have them agreed to ahead of time, and everybody's going to do it their own way through their own campaigns and their own social media platforms and whatnot. But the idea is that they're all going to be talking about the same kind of thing and responding the same way. And the same thing when things go down. How do you do crisis communications together in a way where you're not talking across each other, but a visitor gets a really consistent message for the whole region. And it just takes that alignment ahead of time. And one of the biggest barriers I see is, and I mentioned this earlier, the geopolitical boundary. Well, we can't do that because that's the county over and they're funded differently. And we've got different pots of funding, so we can't advertise together. Yeah, okay, maybe that's true. But can you agree on what the key messages are and then both do them your own way so that if I'm a visitor to that area, I get the same message? I think that's the number one thing, is just agreeing on what the main points are and agreeing to do them your own way.
Perfect, thank you. The next question comes from Southern Oregon. How do we respond on a local level to any branding deterioration that may be felt from a statewide level?
So I assume this branding deterioration is probably mostly tied to wildfire. I'm just guessing. That's really tough because you're dependent on, if you think about your place in the funnel, undoubtedly you're dependent upon that sort of statewide awareness to drive visitors down into the funnel to come to your local destination. And if you're in Southern Oregon, I mean, perhaps there's even an opportunity to collaborate across the border into California too. I don't know how far south you are, but is there a way to talk about a region and to pool some resources in a way that can get more visitor attention in a sort of diminished market? So if you've got a smaller piece of the attention pie, can you band together with some other folks to maybe carve out a bigger piece of that pie? And Alexa's let me know you're from Ashland. And so in Ashland, I know you've got some really unique assets, especially from an arts and culture perspective, that unique in the state, right? And is there a way that you can perhaps work with other parts of Oregon to reach a very particular audience right now. I think a lot of destinations are rethinking who their target visitor is because everything's been changed so much. Is there a new synergy you can find with another target market? So, and I don't know what that looks like for you, but is there an overlap? Is there a Venn diagram between some particular outdoor rec activity and people who appreciate Shakespearean theater? Can you team up with somebody to have a more focused message at a really particular demographic? So in short, I think collaboration is your best tool. It's hard to do because you're often collaborating with people you're also competing with. But in this era of sort of scary messages going out and people worrying, I think finding those folks who are willing to travel, have the means, and maybe have different reasons to come is going to take some collaboration for you to reach out to them.
Perfect. There was a follow-up to that. She was also referring to the Oregon brand and what's happening in Portland and how people are perceiving it, especially what's in the news right now. So especially looking at it from like a destination marketing and management organization lens.
Got it. Okay. So I made a fire assumption, but you're talking about the sort of, now I'm making another assumption, but what's been going on in Portland, I assume this is the social justice protests and that's been national news. Honestly, it surprises me a little bit that goes beyond Portland into places like Ashland, but maybe it does, and maybe that's a little naive on my part that would not affect. I don't know if I have a really good answer to that. I think we have some really entrenched, polarized points of view about reality right now that neither side really resembles the other and what's the perception of what's going on. And that's pretty tough to overcome as a marketing organization, to break through a shell. So I think I would again point to a more regional strategy where you're depending more on people who are from Northern California to Northern Oregon, who aren't going to be burdened by that outsider's perspective of what's going on here in Portland. And we'll see Ashland as the very different place that it is in the near term until I think those perceptions change.
That's also something that I can follow up with my team internally on as well and see if I can get a response back around perceptions there too.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that'd be great. So it is a little bit out of my area of expertise, but
that's something we should be able to tackle as well.
Yeah.
Perfect. So it's 9:58. We have time for maybe one more question if it's out there. Okay, seeing no more coming in, we want to close this out and give a little bit of transition time. Thank you guys so much. Matthew, thank you so much for this time here. Thank you from the Oregon Destination Association, from us at Travel Oregon for your time here, to all the participants for joining us for this hour. We hope that you found this immensely valuable. This toolkit is going to be coming out. I have a link for you that I would like to be able to share. If you guys can open up your chat feature real quickly, I'm going to be sending this out so you guys can comb through this, explore the tools, and we'll be sharing out Matthew's contact information as well if you get a chance to be able to connect in with him, who has been such a resource to not only our organization, but many, especially around the Western US. So please check out that link that's now in the chat feature. Check out the toolkit. And please be sure to fill out the stakeholder survey for Travel Oregon and the survey coming out over the course of the next day to let us know how this feedback went in. Again, we super appreciate your time, and at 10 o'clock on the dot, thank you. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, everybody.